In Florida, even the dead don't stay buried. Bone deep. Chapter 1. The port stern cleat had been broken since February. Not broken in any dramatic way. No storm, no hard landing, no incident worth describing. The cast stainless had developed a hairline fracture in the base where it bolted to the deck, the kind of failure that happens to hardware that spends its whole life in salt air and never gets looked at. Gumbo had noticed it in February, ordered a replacement cleat in March, found the replacement cleat under the port side bench in April, and now it was a Tuesday in late September and he was finally doing something about it. This was, by his own accounting, a reasonable pace for a man who had once managed the logistics schedules of 14 regional distribution centers across 3 time zones. The distribution centers had deadlines with consequences. The cleat had only judgment, which he could live with. He had the old hardware off, and the deck surface cleaned, and the new cleat positioned, and the first bolt started when his phone rang from the wheelhouse table where he'd left it next to a half cup of cold coffee. He let it ring. He got the second bolt started. He got the torque wrench seated on the first bolt and gave it a quarter turn, and then the phone rang again. Same number, same caller, not leaving a message and not giving up, and he set the torque wrench on the deck and went inside. Unknown number. 352 area code, which was Gainesville and points between. Malone. A pause that had preparation in it. The kind of pause that comes before a sentence someone has been rehearsing. Then, Mr. Malone. My name is Clifford Mooney. I was given your number by Pete LaFontaine. Gumbo picked up his cold coffee and drank it anyway. Pete LaFontaine was a retired skip tracer he'd met at the Tiki Torch 14 months ago, under circumstances that had more or less reoriented his entire professional life. And Pete had a talent for knowing people with problems, and a complementary talent for knowing which problems belonged to which person. So far Pete had sent him 2 cases. Both had been unusual. Neither had been boring. What kind of problem, Mr. Mooney? A theft. 3 items irreplaceable, taken from my home 3 weeks ago. Have you reported it to the police? Another pause. This one had more weight. No. That presents a difficulty I'd rather discuss in person. Gumbo put the coffee down and picked up the legal pad from the corner of the folding table. He wrote Mooney, Gainesville, theft, cannot call police in that order. He drew a box around the last item. What is the rate you had in mind, Mr. Mooney? Pete said to offer $500 a day. He said you'd probably take $400. Pete LaFontaine, Gumbo thought, had a detailed understanding of his financial position that Gumbo found simultaneously flattering and inconvenient. $500 works, he said. Plus expenses. Of course. Can you come to Gainesville? He wrote $500 per day, plus expenses on a fresh post-it, and pressed it to the steering wheel above the earlier one from his last case, which he'd left there for reasons he hadn't fully examined. 2 cases. 2 different rates. He was either building a career or accumulating stationery. Tomorrow morning, Gumbo said. Send me the address. He went back to the stern and finished torquing the cleat. It held solid when he tested it, no movement, the deck sealed clean around the base. He stood and pressed his foot against it once, then twice, then decided it was done. One thing finished, which was more than he could say for most of the things on this boat. He drove north the next morning with the windows down, and the radio finding and losing a classic rock station out of Gainesville as the signal played hide-and-seek with the pine flatwoods. The Ranger's check engine light came on at the junction of 19 and 27, as it did periodically and without apparent cause. He tapped the dashboard above the glove box in the spot that worked, and it went off. The Ranger had an opinion about that particular intersection that Gumbo had learned not to investigate. He stopped for coffee at a BP station outside Chiefland and stood at the hood drinking it while a cattle egret worked the grass median with the focused efficiency of something that had its whole morning organized. The egret caught something, swallowed it, and moved on. Gumbo drank his coffee and watched the egret and thought about what kind of person could not call the police about a theft from their own home. The category had layers. There was the person who couldn't call the police because the stolen items were themselves illegal. There was the person who couldn't call the police because calling the police would reveal other things. There was the person who had simply had a previous experience with the police that made the whole enterprise seem futile. And there was the person who had all three going at once, which was the most Florida category of all. Mooney's address put him in a residential neighborhood west of the UF campus, the kind of streets built in the 70s for professors and faculty and left that way, the houses behind oak canopies that had grown together overhead into a tunnel of shade. Ranch-style brick, the lawns kept up without being showy about it. He parked at the curb and sat in the Ranger for a moment. The house had no sign of what it contained. The exterior was a careful nothing, trimmed shrubs, a concrete walkway, a storm door with a standard deadbolt. A man who had thought about visibility and made a decision. Gumbo knocked. Clifford Mooney opened the door, and Gumbo revised his mental image in about half a second. He'd been building toward distinguished academic, silver hair, reading glasses on a cord, the faint, formal quality of a man who spent his career in close proximity to other people's teeth. What he got was closer to a retired ship captain who had taken up bird-watching, compact, sun-browned, eyes that moved between Gumbo and the street behind him in a single practice sweep before the door opened fully. Mooney was 71 and had the posture of a man who had never stopped being careful about it. "Mr. Malone, thank you for coming." He stood back and Gumbo stepped inside and the house changed. Or rather, the house revealed itself. From the outside, it was nothing. From inside, it was the geology wing of a natural history museum that happened to also have a kitchen. Every wall of the entry hall held custom oak display cases, floor to ceiling, lit from inside with LED strips that threw a clean white light across the contents. The first case on the left held marine specimens, mosasaur teeth the length of Gumbo's hand, the flat paddle-shaped propulsive bones of something that had moved through the Cretaceous Sea that covered Florida before Florida was Florida. The case opposite held what looked like a section of articulated jaw, the teeth still seated, labeled in a small neat card, Mammoth Americanum, Oscilla River Levee Company, approximately 11,400 BP. Gumbo stood in the entry hall and turned a slow circle. Mooney watched him do it with the particular expression of a person who has shown this room to very few people and has stopped trying to predict their reactions. "How long have you been collecting?" 19 years. "How many pieces?" 312. 309, as of 3 weeks ago. They went into the living room, which had a sofa and 2 chairs arranged for conversation, and display cases on 3 walls, and a 4th wall that was a single built-in unit holding what Mooney introduced as the Pleistocene megafauna collection. The Ice Age dead, displayed behind glass. A dire wolf skull with both canines intact. A short-faced bear's foot bones fanned out in anatomical position. A section of giant armadillo shell, the hexagonal plates still articulated. And a gap on the bottom shelf, the foam-lined empty space showing clearly where something large and significant had sat. Mooney did not look at the gap directly. He looked near it, the way you look near a thing when looking at it directly costs something. "Tell me what was taken," Gumbo said. Mooney sat in the chair nearest the window and described the 3 missing specimens with the precision of a man who had memorized every detail of every piece he owned and needed no notes to recall any of it. The first, a near-complete mastodon skull, upper and lower jaws articulated, the molars intact on both sides, the lower tusks present, though one had a 3-inch repair from an old fracture. River pull, estimated at 14 years, meaning it had been out of the water for 14 years before Mooney acquired it. Purchased through a private broker for $68,000. It had occupied the bottom center of the living room display for 11 years. The second, a dire wolf cranium, specimen quality, the sagittal crest intact and pronounced, the zygomatic arches unbroken on both sides. These didn't come complete, Mooney said that twice. The zygomatic arches always broke in the river, always, and this one had both. $41,000. He had turned down a higher offer 3 years ago from a buyer in Germany because he didn't want it to leave the country. The third, a set of articulated giant ground sloth vertebrae, 6 thoracic elements, the processes intact, the intervertebral cartilage petrified in place so the sequence held its original curve. Pulled from the Peace River in Hardy County. He didn't say what he'd paid for them, and Gumbo didn't ask. Nothing else was touched. Nothing. They walked past $250,000 in other material without disturbing it. They knew exactly what they came for. Gumbo wrote the 3 specimens in his legal pad with their approximate values and drew a line across the page beneath them. He wrote, targeted. Not opportunistic. Somebody gave somebody a shopping list. Your alarm system. Monitored. ADT. They bypassed it, not disabled it. The panel showed a normal disarm at 8:47 p.m. They had the code. Yes. How many people know the code? Mooney was quiet for a moment. 3. Myself. My cleaning service, a company, they send different people, they share the code among staff. And my broker. Your fossil broker. Yes. The word broker sat in the room between them. Gumbo let it sit. Mooney had introduced it himself, which meant he'd already run the arithmetic and arrived at an answer he didn't like and was waiting to see if Gumbo arrived at the same one. Tell me about the broker, Gumbo said. Mooney shifted in the chair. He was a contained man, minimal movement, and the shift was the equivalent of someone else standing up and walking around the room. Her name is Darlene Pickett. She operates out of Palatka. I've worked with her for 11 years. You trust her? I trusted her. Which is a different thing. Gumbo wrote Darlene Pickett, Palatka broker alarm code. He looked at what he'd written. He drew a small question mark after broker and a larger one after alarm code. What is the legal status of the collection, Mr. Mooney? A long pause. Outside, a mockingbird ran through 4 different songs in rapid sequence, as if demonstrating the full range of things that could be said on a subject before picking one. Complicated, Mooney said. Felony complicated, or misdemeanor complicated. Mooney looked at the empty space on the bottom shelf of the display case. Vertebrate fossil material, recovered from Florida state waterways, he said, belongs to the state of Florida under statute. Every significant specimen in this house came from a river. Ownership is a violation of that statute. Commercial transfer, buying, selling is a felony. He said it with the delivery of a man who had recited this fact to himself periodically for 19 years and made his peace with it, more or less, and was now reciting it to someone else for the first time. So you cannot go to the police, because the police would want to know where you got a $68,000 mastodon skull. That is the difficulty, yes. And the broker knew that. Everyone in this market knows that. The illegality is what makes it a market. Legal specimens, the ones properly permitted, pulled from private land, documented, they are worth a fraction of these. Museums can buy them. Academics can study them. The price stays low because the supply is not constrained. He said it with the mild delivery of someone explaining a supply and demand curve, which it was. Gumbo had spent 11 years in logistics. He understood supply chains. He understood that every supply chain had friction, and that friction was either cost or profit, depending on which side of it you stood on. This one just had handcuffs attached. I will need a full written inventory of the 3 pieces, Gumbo said. Physical descriptions, provenance as best you have it, any photographs you took. Mooney went to a desk in the corner and returned with a manila folder. Inside, 3 typed pages, 1 per specimen with photographs clipped to each. He'd prepared it before Gumbo arrived. The photographs were good, multiple angles, scale reference, detail shots of the unique identifiers. The repaired tusk fracture, the intact zygomatic arches, the curve of the sloth vertebrae. A careful man with a careful system, who had been careful for 19 years, and was now sitting in a house with 3 gaps in his collection and no legal recourse. One more question, Gumbo said. The broker, Darlene Pickett. Does she know the specimens are missing? Mooney folded his hands on his knee. I called her the morning after. She expressed appropriate concern. She said she'd ask around the secondary market and let me know if anything surfaced. A beat. She hasn't called back. That was 3 weeks of silence from a woman who had the alarm code and the inventory knowledge, and a professional network that ran the length of every fossil-producing river in the state. I will start in Palatka, Gumbo said. He drove home on 75 South because the interstate was faster and he needed the time to think without navigating. The folder sat on the passenger seat. He'd looked at the photographs at Mooney's dining table before he left, spent 15 minutes with them the way he'd learned to spend time with inventory, looking at what was there before looking at what was missing. The mastodon skull had a quality in the photos that the written description didn't fully convey. It was large in the way that things from the deep past are large, before the world's megafauna got edited down to what's left. Broad nasal arch, the eye sockets set wide, the cranium tapering to the rear where the muscles had once attached to a neck thick enough to carry the weight of all that bone. 14 years out of a Florida river, and it still looked like something that had opinions about the world. Gumbo drove and thought about Darlene Pickett. In logistics, the broker was always the pressure point. Not because brokers were dishonest, most weren't. The margin didn't support it. The long game value of a trusted network beat any single score. But brokers were the intersection. Every flow in the network passed through them. If something went sideways in a supply chain, you traced it to the last broker who touched it and worked from there. 3 weeks of silence from a woman who had the alarm code and the inventory knowledge. That was either fear or complicity, and the distinction mattered because they led to different conversations. He pulled off at a rest stop outside Ocala to stretch and call Pete LaFontaine. Pete picked up on the second ring with the easy rhythm of a man who kept irregular hours and didn't mind interruption. Gumbo. You meet Mooney? Just left him. Good man. Bit unusual. Pete. His house is a museum. I know. Impressive, right? It is also a felony in every room. Pete made the sound of a man who had thought about this and arrived somewhere to the left of concern. Those bones were going to end up in somebody's basement regardless. At least Mooney keeps the humidity controlled. This was Pete LaFontaine's general philosophy of the world, which held that most things were going to happen anyway, and the only real variable was whether they happened well or badly, and that a man who controlled the humidity was doing his part. What do you know about a broker named Darlene Pickett? Palatka, place called the Stone Age. A pause with recognition in it. Darlene's been around a long time. Knows every diver from here to Charlotte County. Honest in her way. She doesn't misrepresent product and she doesn't sell the same piece twice. Whether she had anything to do with your thing, I couldn't say. She had the alarm code. Pete was quiet for 3 full seconds, which from Pete constituted a grave expression of concern. Well, he said, that does complicate the read. What is the secondary market like right now? Any new buyers moving in? Any tension? Another pause. There's been some friction. I hear things at the Tiki Torch from people who hear things elsewhere. The high-end overseas market has gotten more organized in the last couple years. Used to be private collectors operating independently. Now there's more structure to it, which means more money moving, which means more competition for the top specimens. He paused again. Which means the top specimens are more worth stealing than they used to be. How much more? Enough that people who did not used to do this kind of thing are starting to think about it. Gumbo stood at the rest stop picnic table with I-75 traffic running past and wrote secondary market more organized overseas competition in his legal pad. He drew a line connecting it to Darlene Pickett and left the other end open. Pete, is there anything about this I should know before I go to Palatka? Pete thought about it long enough that Gumbo could hear ice moving in a glass. Talk to Darlene before you talk to anybody else. She knows the whole board. She'll tell you more than she means to if you let her run. That is useful. Also, she makes very good boiled peanuts. Wet style, not the dry kind. Get a bag. Noted, Gumbo said and hung up. He got back in the Ranger. The check engine light stayed off. The folder stayed on the passenger seat, the mastodon skull looking up from the top photograph with the flat patience of something that had been waiting 12,000 years already and had no strong feelings about another few days. He drove south towards Cedar Key and thought about Palatka in the morning. The Pelican was on the fuel dock piling when he came down the marina walkway at 6:30, or a pelican was. Same posture, same unhurried survey of the channel below. He gave it a nod that he immediately felt self-conscious about and went aboard. The new cleat held when he stepped across it. He checked it twice before going below. Some things you just want to know are solid before you walk into whatever's next. Chapter 2. He drove north out of Cedar Key before 7, the day coming up gray and flat over the Gulf, the marsh grass still and silver in the low light. He'd printed the satellite image of Darlene Pickett's establishment from the marina's printer the night before, the one that jammed on every third job and had done so reliably for as long as he'd lived aboard, which was going on 11 months. He'd stood there for 4 minutes coaxing it before the page finally came through, wrinkled at one corner, the image good enough to tell him what he needed to know. The Stone Age sat on US 17 south of Palatka, on a stretch of road built for the kind of commerce that had once required a gas station, and now required whatever had replaced gas stations in the Florida interior economy. Airboat tours, boiled peanuts, the stubborn residue of 1,000 transactions between people who preferred not to be documented. The building was low, cinder block painted a warm ochre. The old pump island still there under a corrugated metal canopy with the hoses removed. Hand-lettered signs on 2x4s. A flag that was not any official flag, but was the kind of flag that said something about the proprietor's relationship with authority, which Gumbo read as informational. He pulled the Ranger into the gravel lot at 9:20 and sat for a moment with the engine off. 2 other vehicles, a mud-red Silverado with a kayak rack and a Subaru wagon with a University of Florida parking sticker that was 3 years expired. The shop was open. He could see light through the screen door and hear a radio doing something in the country-adjacent genre that had 16 sub-genres now, and he couldn't keep them straight. He'd thought about his approach on the drive up. Not a script. He'd learned quickly enough that scripts fell apart at the door, but a posture. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't a buyer. He wasn't threatening anything, and wasn't pretending to threaten anything. He was a PI from Cedar Key who had been hired by a private collector to locate specific stolen property, and the trail ran through Palatka, and the most direct path through Palatka ran through this woman. He would say that, more or less, and see what she did with it. The screen door had a spring that announced him. The interior of the Stone Age was the organized chaos of a place that had been accumulating inventory for longer than it had been organizing it. The front room held genuine antiques arranged with just enough care to suggest curation without achieving it. A pressed tin ceiling that dated the building, a glass-topped display counter running the length of the left wall, shelving on the right, stacked with reproduction fossils in cellophane bags and priced at $10. Shark teeth mostly. Ammonite casts. A bin of what were labeled genuine megalodon teeth. Florida rivers that were genuine insofar as they had come out of a river at some point, which described most of the sediment in Florida. Tourist fossils had a different quality than the real thing. Gumbo had spent 15 minutes with Mooney's photographs, and he could see the difference now, the way you could see the difference between a reproduction painting and the actual thing once someone had explained to you what you were looking for. The bin specimens had the right color, the right heft and approximate scale, but they lacked the density of objects that had spent 10,000 years compressed under river sediment. They were light, in a way the real things were not. A woman came through a doorway at the back of the room, carrying a cardboard box, and set it on the counter without looking up. "Be right with you." She was 63, and looked it in the way that some people look their age without it being a subtraction. Sun-browned, silver-haired, the kind of lean that comes from moving through a working life rather than from attending to it. She had reading glasses on a cord around her neck, and the hands of someone who had handled fragile things for a long time and knew how to do it without thinking about it. She opened the box and began sorting its contents, small tagged items, Gumbo couldn't see what from where he stood, into groups on the counter with the focused economy of someone completing a task that deserved to be completed before anything else. He waited. He'd learned that waiting in a room was its own form of information. The radio played. A ceiling fan turned at a speed calibrated to move air without cooling it, which in late September in Palatka was the best available option. She looked up. Her eyes moved over him in a single sweep that had professional assessment in it, not threat assessment, inventory assessment. The eyes of someone who had been cataloging what walked through her door for 40 years and had developed a rapid and accurate system. He watched her arrive at, not a buyer, not a tourist, not local, in about 2 seconds and recalibrate accordingly. "Help you?" "Darlene Pickett." "Depends on what you need from her." "My name is Danny Malone. I'm a pie out of Cedar Key. I've been hired by a private collector to locate 3 specimens that were stolen from his home about 3 weeks ago. The trail runs through your network." He paused. "I have no interest in your business model. I'm not interested in your inventory, your customers, or anything about the way you operate. I'm interested in 3 specific pieces and who currently has them." She set down the item she was holding. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone receiving information she had been expecting for a while and deciding how she felt about its arrival. "Sit down, Mr. Malone," she said. "You want coffee? I've got a pot going." "I'm fine. Thank you. I'm getting some, anyway." She disappeared through the back doorway and came back with a mug that had a cartoon alligator on it and a slogan he didn't read fast enough. She pulled a stool from behind the counter and settled onto it with the ease of a woman in a room she had owned for decades. "Who's the collector?" "I'd rather not say yet." She nodded once, unsurprised. "The pieces." He laid the inventory sheets on the counter, Mooney's typed descriptions, no photographs, he'd left those in the folder, and watched her read them. She read slowly. That was the first thing. A person who knew what they were looking at didn't need to read slowly. The words confirmed what they already knew. Darlene Pickett read every line of every description, and her face did a small amount of work on the mastodon skull entry and a larger amount of work on the dire wolf cranium, and then she set the pages down and drank her coffee. "These are exceptional specimens." "Yes." "The zygomatic arches on that dire wolf." She shook her head, not elaborating. The shake was the elaboration. "Do you know them?" She looked at him over the mug. "I know a lot of specimens, Mr. Malone. This is a small world." "I understand that. I'm asking about these 3 specifically." She set the mug down and looked at the middle distance for a moment, the look of someone running a calculation that had several variables, and some of them were personal. Gumbo had seen this look in meetings for 11 years. He knew not to fill the silence. "I don't know who took them," she said. "I want to be clear about that before anything else." "All right. But I know they went missing." Word moves in this market. Something like that mastodon skull, that quality, that provenance, people notice when it stops being where it was and starts being somewhere else. She paused. Or stops being anywhere at all, which is what it looked like from the outside. 3 weeks ago, that specimen effectively ceased to exist on the secondary market. Which is not how specimens behave. Gumbo wrote in his legal pad. "You said it stopped being where it was. You know where it was." A fractional pause. "I move product, Mr. Malone. I've been doing it for 22 years. Some of that product I've touched more than once over its history. Pieces come back to market. They change hands. A specimen of that caliber, I may have seen it before. You brokered it originally." She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. She picked up her coffee. These were, Gumbo had learned all forms of answer. "Somebody gave somebody a shopping list," Gumbo said. "Those 3 pieces, nothing else. Whoever took them had access information and knew exactly what they were taking. That's not a random theft." "No. Who's been asking about these pieces on the secondary market since they went missing?" This was the real question. He'd been working toward it since he walked in, and he watched her know that and decide what to do about it. She had the manner of someone who had been talking around things for so long that the talking around had become a kind of honesty, not deception, navigation. She was deciding which direction to navigate. She set the mug down on the counter and picked up one of the inventory sheets and looked at it without reading it, the way you pick something up when you're thinking and need something to do with your hands. "There's a man out of Ocala," she said. "Does jobs. Not a collector, not a dealer, a facilitator. He takes contracts when the contract requires certain capabilities that most people in this business don't have and don't want to have." Name. She hesitated for one more beat, the last check of her own navigation, and then set it over the rim of the reproduction ammonite she'd picked up from the display beside the counter without seeming to notice she'd done it. "Tuck Party. Ocala. Outside it. Scrubland west of town, 12 acres, a metal shop on the back of the property." She put the ammonite down. "He doesn't typically sit on inventory. That's not his operating model. If he has these pieces, and I'm not saying he does, then something went wrong with the transaction they were meant for. And Tuck Party is sitting on $150,000 of property he cannot sell and cannot explain." She said it with the tone of someone delivering a weather report about weather they'd seen coming. "What went wrong with the transaction?" A longer pause this time. She smoothed the edge of one of the inventory sheets with her thumb. "The market has gotten complicated. There are buyers now who weren't in it 3 years ago. Some of them have more organizational support than the traditional collectors. When that kind of money comes into a market that's been running on personal relationships for 20 years, the personal relationships get," she paused, looking for the right word, "stressed." "Buyers plural," Gumbo said. "Competing for the same material." She looked at him. He had the sense of a person realizing they'd said slightly more than they'd meant to, and deciding it was all right. "Among other things," she said. She picked up her mug and found it empty and set it down again. "You're going to Ocala." "Yes." "Tuck's not a hard man to talk to. He's not going to cause you a problem. Whatever situation he's in right now, returning those bones to their owner is probably the cleanest exit available to him. And Tuck Party is, at his core, a man who looks for the cleanest exit." She paused. "Just don't get there before noon." He keeps late hours. Gumbo gathered the inventory sheets from the counter and put them back in the folder. He stood. On his way to the door, he stopped. On the shelf beside the door, between a wire rack of postcards showing aerial views of the St. Johns River and a small wood display of shark teeth priced in the 5 to 20 range for the tourist-adjacent customer, sat a single fossilized horse tooth. River dark, dense, the enamel ridges worn smooth on the occlusal surface in the particular pattern that said grass eater and meant it. Not a reproduction. Not bin material. The real thing, sitting on a shelf with a $5 price tag in a wire holder that didn't fit it. He picked it up, turned it over. The root was intact, the color consistent throughout, no repair. This was a specimen someone had pulled from a river, and it had ended up here, priced like a souvenir, because it was easier than explaining the alternative. He put it back. When he turned, Darlene Pickett was watching him from the counter with the expression of a person watching a man who has just understood something figure out what to do with the understanding. "Boiled peanuts," she said. "Bags by the door. Wet style. Take one." He took one. He drove east and then south on the bridge over the St. Johns, the river wide and dark below him, running slow in the way of rivers that have been doing what they're doing since before there was anyone to watch them do it. The morning had cleared off. The sky was the pale high blue of the Florida interior in late September, the live oaks along the bank green-black against it. He could see the far shore, a half-mile of dark water separating it from where he'd just been. Somewhere upstream, a diver was running his hand along a riverbed in the dark. It was a thing Gumbo had thought about since reading the statute Mooney had recited to him from memory. The sheer patient accretion of it, the river giving back what the Pleistocene left behind one piece at a time, the bones coming up through silt and current into hands that knew what they were and immediately moved them into an economy that officially didn't exist. The supply was effectively infinite. The demand was specific and organized and growing. The middle, the broker layer, was Darlene Pickett, and a dozen like her, absorbing the friction and smoothing the transfer. He thought about what she'd said about buyers. Buyers plural. Competing. The careful way she'd said organizational support, and then let the phrase sit without adding to it. He opened his legal pad on the passenger seat at the next stop sign and wrote buyers, plural, competing, organized, and put a circle around the whole line. Then he wrote Tuck Party, Ocala Noon, and drew an arrow forward from it. Then he wrote a word below the circle that was not Tuck Party's name or Darlene Pickett's name or Mooney's name. It was just a word she'd used once and then talked about something else, the way you use a word you didn't entirely intend to use and hope the other person doesn't notice. He'd noticed. The word was overlap. He drove toward Ocala with the legal pad on the seat and the bag of boiled peanuts on the dash, the St. Johns falling away behind him and the interstate gathering ahead, and thought about what it meant when two buyers who'd been operating in separate lanes long enough to get comfortable started appearing in each other's territory. He thought about it the same way he used to think about distribution networks that had been running in regional silos when the regional managers got ambitious. In logistics, that problem had a name. It was called consolidation pressure, and it had a standard resolution, and the resolution was never comfortable for anyone in the middle of it. He was, by every reasonable metric, in the middle of it. He ate a boiled peanut and drove. Chapter 3. He took the noon instructions seriously and stopped for lunch at a diner outside Gainesville that had a hand-painted sign in the window advertising a hot beef sandwich and a hand-painted sign beside it advertising the same hot beef sandwich at a lower price, which he understood to be the passage of time made visible. He ate the sandwich and drank 2 cups of coffee and looked at his legal pad and thought about how to approach a man he knew almost nothing about, except that Darlene Pickett, who chose her words the way a surgeon chose instruments, had called him someone who looked for the cleanest exit. That was useful. A man looking for the cleanest exit and a man who could offer him one were, in theory, natural conversation partners. In practice, Gumbo had learned, most conversations about returning stolen property ran through a territory of pride and suspicion before they arrived anywhere useful. The trick was not to hurry them through it. He left the diner at 11:40 and drove west of Ocala on a county road that turned from asphalt to chip seal to packed clay in 3/4-mile increments, the pine flatwoods giving way to scrub, the scrub giving way to 12 acres of organized disorder, announced by a galvanized gate standing open on a gravel drive. He stopped at the gate and waited, as Darlene had not told him to, but as the situation clearly required. 3 dogs came from around the back of the double-wide, at a speed that suggested they had been waiting professionally for exactly this. They were mixed breed, mid-sized, healthy-looking, the kind of dogs that had a job and took it seriously. They announced him to the property, and to anyone on it, and to, Gumbo suspected, at least one neighboring property 200 yards through the scrub. He sat in the Ranger with the window up and let them complete their obligations. The front door of the double-wide opened. A man came out onto the wood plank porch and looked at the Ranger and looked at the dogs and said something to the dogs that Gumbo couldn't hear. The dogs relocated to a shady patch beside the porch steps and became furniture. Gumbo got out. Tuck party was not what the property prepared you for. The property prepared you for a certain type, the rural North Central Florida operator running parallel enterprises below the level of official attention, rough-edged, suspicious, communication style calibrated to minimum disclosure. Gumbo had been adjusting his approach to that type for the last 30 miles of chip seal road. What he got was a lean man of 46 in a clean work shirt and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the glasses belonging to a face that was thinking about something before Gumbo pulled in and had not entirely stopped thinking about it. He had the kind of hands that came from decades of mechanical work, scarred across the knuckles, permanently stained at the creases in a way that soap addressed but didn't solve, and he carried them with the ease of someone who had made peace with what they looked like. He looked at Gumbo the way a man looks at someone he's been half expecting. "Malone," he said. Not a question. Gumbo stopped at the base of the porch steps. "Tuck party. Darlene call ahead." She did not. Party nodded once, a small acknowledgement of something confirmed. She wouldn't. That's not how Darlene operates. He looked at the Ranger, then back at Gumbo. "You want a beer?" "A little early for me." "Thank you." "Suit yourself." He reached into the porch cooler without looking at it, the coordination of a man who had been reaching into that cooler for a long time, and came up with a can and cracked it, and sat in one of 2 lawn chairs arranged in the shade of a live oak that had been growing beside the porch long enough to have opinions about the placement of the porch. He tilted his chin at the other chair. Gumbo sat. The property organized itself around him as his eyes adjusted to the shade. The metal shop behind the double-wide, large, the kind of construction that had cost real money and been done correctly. A flatbed trailer. An enclosed cargo trailer, padlocked. 2 ATVs under a lean-to. A John boat on a trailer with a 40-horse Yamaha that had been recently serviced. He could see the new plug wires from here. A chest freezer on the far end of the porch, humming. The scrubland running out in every direction, longleaf pine and palmetto. A red-shouldered hawk turning slow circles above the far tree line in the thermal that came up off the pale sand. Party drank his beer and waited. He had the patience of someone who had learned that most conversations arrived at their real subject eventually, and that hurrying them only added noise. Gumbo let the silence run for a moment, and then decided it had run enough. "I'm a pie out of Cedar Key. I've been hired by a private collector in Gainesville to recover 3 stolen specimens. Mastodon skull, dire wolf cranium, articulated sloth vertebrae. All 3 taken from his home approximately 3 weeks ago by someone with the alarm code and a specific inventory list. He paused. I have no interest in how they were taken or on whose behalf. I have no interest in anything about you or your business except whether you currently have them and whether we can arrive at an arrangement that gets them back to their owner. Party turned his beer can slowly in his hands. A man doing something with his hands so the rest of him could think. What's the collector's name? I'd rather hold that for now. Fair enough. He looked out at the property. You want to ask me if I have them? Do you have them? Party finished approximately a third of his beer in a considered swallow. He looked at the hawk, which was still up there, still turning. That's a question with a specific legal weight attached to it, and I'm not going to answer it the way you asked it. What I will tell you is that I took a contract 3 weeks ago to acquire specific specimens from a specific location for a specific buyer, and that the transaction for which I acquired them has since developed complications that make completing it something other than advisable. What kind of complications? He looked at Gumbo for the first time since they'd sat down. The reading glasses on his forehead caught the dappled light through the live oak. Do you know the market you're in? I'm learning it. Then I'll give you the short version, and you can tell me what questions you have. He set the beer can on the arm of the chair and laced his fingers across his stomach with the posture of a man who was about to be precise about something. This market has been running on 2 parallel tracks for about 15 years. The domestic track, private collectors, mostly Florida and the Southeast, people who want specific specimens for personal reasons and have the money to pay for them and the discretion to keep quiet about it. That track I understand. That track has rules, even if the rules are informal, and the people on it mostly follow them because they have reputations to protect, and the market is small enough that reputation is the only currency that matters. He picked up his beer. The other track is newer. High-end overseas buyers, private museums, collectors in countries where what you can own has different parameters than here. That market has been organizing itself for the last 5 or 6 years. More money, more structure, a specific kind of logistics operation running the supply side. The domestic track and the overseas track used to stay in their lanes. Lately, they've been moving into each other's territory. Overlap, Gumbo said. Party looked at him. Darlene did talk to you. She gave me your name. The word was mine. A short nod. Overlap is the polite version. The impolite version is that the man running the overseas supply chain has been acquiring from domestic sources in a way the man running the domestic end considers a territorial violation. The domestic operator does not have a patient relationship with territorial violations. He took a corrective action, which was the contract I accepted. The intent was to move those specific specimens, which had been routed through the overseas supply chain to a Gainesville collector, back into domestic inventory as a message. He paused. The overseas operator found out before the transaction completed, which means I am currently sitting between 2 men who are having an argument about property and market share. And those 3 specimens are the physical manifestation of that argument, and I am the person currently holding them. He said freight trains with his expression rather than his words, the particular weariness of a man who had done a job correctly and been outrun by the context surrounding it. Is the domestic operator aware the transaction didn't complete? He's aware. He's not pleased. I've been managing communication on that front. A beat. Managing it imperfectly. And the overseas operator is aware the specimens exist and are accessible and has an interest in their location. Yes. Gumbo looked at the metal shop. The large roll-up door was down. The smaller walk-in door beside it, fitted with a commercial-grade deadbolt that was new enough to still be shiny. The building had a wall-mounted HVAC unit running at the far end, a faint mechanical hum across the yard. Do you want those bones off your property? Party was quiet for a moment. A cardinal ran through 3 bars of something in the scrub. The hawk was gone from the thermal, replaced by nothing, the sky empty and pale. I want to finish my beer first, he said. And then yes. Getting those particular items out of that particular building would resolve the single largest problem I currently have. And I am not a man who turns down the opportunity to resolve his largest problem when it comes to him on a Tuesday and doesn't require anything complicated. He looked at Gumbo. You're not going to arrest me. I am a private investigator from Cedar Key. I have no authority to arrest anyone anywhere. Good, Hardy said and finished his beer. The metal shop was 28 feet wide and 40 deep. The floor poured concrete with a drain in the center. The walls hung with toolboards and shelving that held the organized inventory of a man who ran multiple operations and kept them sorted. Welding equipment. Dive gear in a rack. 2 sets of doubles, regulators hanging dry, BCDs on hooks. A kayak cart. Lengths of PVC pipe, sorted by diameter. The enclosed cargo trailer's contents had clearly lived in here at some point. There were outlines on the concrete where crates had sat. The foam-lined shelving at the back of the shop was not like the rest of it. It was purpose-built, the foam cut to fit specific dimensions, each shelf at a different height. Climate-controlled by the HVAC unit he'd seen outside, the air in here noticeably cooler and drier than the yard. The kind of storage that cost money and reflected a specific understanding of what was being stored. The 3 specimens sat on their shelves in the clean white light of LED shop floods. The mastodon skull occupied the bottom shelf, which had been built low and wide to accommodate it. It was larger than the photographs had conveyed. Photographs always reduced this kind of scale, flattened it into a manageable image, and the image was not the thing. The thing was the size of a large suitcase. The nasal arch broad and heavy, the eye sockets set wide and deep, the molars on both sides intact and worn in the grinding pattern of an animal that had processed enormous quantities of vegetation over an enormous number of years. The lower jaw was articulated, the whole skull held together by the fossilization process that had replaced bone with mineral over 12,000 years of river sediment. One lower tusk present and intact. The other present with a 3-inch repair in brown epoxy at the mid-shaft. The repair done by someone who knew what they were doing. The break below it, probably from the original river pole. Gumbo looked at it for a moment. He had seen photographs. He had read descriptions. He had heard Mooney enumerate the provenance, and the purchase price, and the 11 years it had occupied the bottom center of the living room display. None of that had prepared him for the specific quality of presence that the actual object had in an actual room, the weight of it, the density, the sense of a thing that had come from a world that no longer existed and had survived the distance between that world and this one by being more durable than anything that had tried to stop it. He took out his phone and photographed it from 4 angles. He photographed the dire wolf cranium, smaller, compact, the sagittal crest running clean and pronounced down the center of the skull, both zygomatic arches intact as Mooney had said and as Darlene Pickett had reacted to without elaborating. He photographed the sloth vertebrae, 6 thoracic elements arranged in their anatomical curve on a shelf of shaped foam, the intervertebral material holding the sequence the way it had held it in the living animal. Then he called Mooney. Mooney picked up on the second ring, with the slightly breathless quality of a man who had been waiting for a call and had not wanted to appear to be waiting for it. "I'm looking at your mastodon skull," Gumbo said. A sound came through the phone that Gumbo filed away and did not describe to himself at the time and would think about later. It was not a word. It was the involuntary vocal response of a person encountering something they had been missing. Not just wanted, missing, the way you miss a thing that has been part of your daily life and is abruptly not. Pure and unguarded, over before Mooney could have chosen to contain it. "Is it intact?" Mooney asked. His voice had steadied, but not entirely. All three are intact. The repair on the left, lower tusk. Brown epoxy, midshaft, my repair. I did it 7 years ago when the tine shifted in a temperature fluctuation. Brown epoxy, midshaft. The zygomatic arches on the dire wolf are both present. A longer silence. Both. Both. And the sloth sequence looks complete. Can you confirm 6 thoracic elements? 6 thoracic, yes. The third from the anterior end has a healed stress fracture on the right transverse process. You'll see it as a faint line. Gumbo looked at the third vertebra from the front of the sequence. The line was there, a slightly darker seam in the fossil matrix across the lateral process, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking. Confirmed. Mr. Malone. Mooney's voice had the quality of a man choosing his words carefully because any of them might give away more than he wanted to give. Thank you. I'll have them to you tomorrow. I need to arrange transport. He hung up and looked at Party, who had been standing near the shop door with his arms crossed, giving Gumbo the room and the phone call without comment. I need to rent a cargo van. U-Haul on 27 in Ocala. 20 minutes. Party looked at the shelving. I'll have the crates ready. I've got proper foam packing. I'm not putting a 12,000-year-old skull in a moving blanket. Appreciated. He drove to Ocala and rented the van and drove back, and they loaded the specimens together, Party pulling crates from beneath the foam shelving and packing each piece with the focused care of someone who had moved fragile and irreplaceable things before and understood that the moving was its own form of responsibility regardless of anything else about the transaction. He set the vertebrae individually in cut foam and aligned them in their anatomical sequence, and then packed a layer of foam above them before closing the crate. He packed the dire wolf cranium in a box within a box, inner foam, outer foam, no movement when you shook it. The mastodon skull took the largest crate and 20 minutes, and both of them, Party directing the placement with the authority of someone who had done this specific thing before. They slid the crates into the back of the van, and Gumbo padded the spaces between them with the moving blankets the U-Haul had provided and tied them off with the cargo straps. Party checked each strap without being asked and tightened 2 of them a quarter turn. In the driveway with the van running, Gumbo rolled down the window. You should know, Party said. He was standing with his hands in his back pockets, the afternoon light long and slanted across the scrub behind him. The 2 men involved in this situation are going to make noise at each other before long. The pressure's been building since spring, and this, he tilted his head at the van, was a match thrown into it. Whatever happens next happens between them. But the geography of it is going to be unpleasant for anyone in the middle when it does. He said it the way you tell a stranger the road ahead has a bad stretch, not a threat information. A man with a decent enough nature giving someone who hadn't earned it a weather report. You want to be somewhere else when it goes. I intend to be, Gumbo said. Party nodded. He looked at the van for a moment, and then looked at Gumbo. That mastodon skull is one of the 5 best specimens I've ever handled. And I've handled a lot of specimens. He said it without apparent feeling, the way a professional acknowledges quality in a thing regardless of the circumstances surrounding it. I'm glad it's going back to somebody who knows what it is. Gumbo drove out through the open gate and turned south on the clay road. He drove the U-Haul at 58 miles an hour because 58 was the number that felt right for a cargo van containing $150,000 of prehistoric bone on Florida state roads, and because the weight in the back had a quality to it that he could feel in the steering. Not destabilizing, just present, a reminder that the van was carrying something that had its own opinions about being jostled. He drove and thought about Tuck Party. There was a type he'd encountered in logistics, the contractor who operated at the edge of the formal system, who ran jobs that the formal system needed done but preferred not to document. He'd worked with several of them over 11 years, mostly in the transportation end, where the gap between what the paperwork said and what the truck was actually carrying was sometimes a commercial necessity and sometimes something else. The best of them had the same quality Party had: a professional self-possession, a clear-eyed accounting of what they were and were not, and a genuine competence at the thing they did that sat entirely separate from any moral evaluation of whether they should be doing it. He didn't know what Tuck Party did on the other 11 months of the year. He knew that Party packed a fossilized mastodon skull with the care of a conservator and tightened cargo straps he hadn't been asked to check, and that he'd said, "I'm glad it's going back to somebody who knows what it is," with the plainness of someone who meant exactly that and nothing else. He drove south on 75 toward Gainesville in the long late afternoon and thought about the word overlap and what it had meant in Darlene Pickett's shop, and what it had meant in Tuck Party's account of the contract, and what it meant now that he was in a rented van between two men who were using the fossil market as a proxy for a territorial argument that had been building since spring. Two freight trains. Same track. Building pressure. In logistics, when two regional supply chains started occupying the same territory, the resolution had a structure to it. First, the test moves, each side probing the other's response time and tolerance. Then the escalation, when the test moves didn't produce the desired correction. Then the resolution, which was either a negotiated boundary or a consolidation, and consolidation meant one chain absorbed or eliminated the other, and the middle layer, the brokers, the facilitators, the contractors, got sorted out in the process without much consultation. Tuck Party had said, before long. Gumbo had a client in Gainesville with his bones back, and his alarm code changed and his collection behind closed doors, and the professional obligation was satisfied, and the rest of it, the freight trains, the territory, the building pressure, was above his pay grade and outside his jurisdiction. He drove at 58 miles an hour, and told himself this was a completed case and mostly believed it. The word spring sat in the back of his mind next to the word overlap and did not feel finished. The sun was down by the time he reached Gainesville. The sky the bruised purple of the Florida interior at full dark, the streetlights coming on along Archer Road as he turned north toward Mooney's neighborhood. He could hear nothing from the back of the van. The specimens were riding quiet, the way things rode quiet when they were packed correctly and had 12,000 years of patience to draw on. He found a parking spot on the street in front of the house and sat for a moment with the engine off. Tomorrow, he would carry the bones back inside. Mooney would unpack them with the reverence of a man handling something he had thought he'd lost. The foam-lined gap on the bottom shelf of the living room display would close. Tonight, he would sleep in the van in front of the house with the doors locked, because the bones had made it this far, and he was not going to lose them in the last 12 hours to someone whose timing was better than his planning. He reclined the seat as far as the van's geometry allowed, and closed his eyes and listened to the neighborhood settle into the dark around him. Somewhere between Ocala and Tampa, two men were looking at the same map and arriving at the same conclusion about what needed to happen next. He slept with the van keys in his hand. Chapter 4. The Freight Trains. He was awake before 6, the van's windows fogged from the inside, the neighborhood coming up gray and quiet around him. A mockingbird was doing its full repertoire in the live oak 3 houses down. He checked the cargo doors from the driver's seat, both locked, the padlock he'd bought at the Ocala U-Haul still seated, and then got out and stretched his back against the side of the van and looked at Mooney's house. The lights were on inside. Mooney was awake. Gumbo suspected Mooney had been awake for some time. He called from the curb. Mooney answered before the first ring finished. "I'll put coffee on," Mooney said, which was as close as he came to saying what he meant, which was, "Come now, immediately, please." They carried the crates in through the front door, Gumbo on one end and Mooney on the other, 2 trips for the outer crates, and a third for the mastodon skull's crate alone, because it was large and heavy, and Mooney's hands on his end of it had a particular quality, careful past the point of caution, the grip of a man handling something he had been afraid he would never handle again. They set it in the living room, on the cleared section of floor that Mooney had apparently prepared at some point during the night. Gumbo drank his coffee at the kitchen table and gave Mooney the room. He could hear the sound of packing foam being lifted and set aside, the soft displacement of air that came with opening a well-sealed crate. He heard nothing that indicated damage. He heard once the sound of a man exhaling slowly through his nose, in the register of someone confirming something they had been afraid to confirm until it was confirmed. After 15 minutes, Mooney came to the kitchen doorway. "All three," he said. "All intact. The vertebrae sequence is undisturbed." He looked at Gumbo with the expression of someone who had arrived at a feeling and did not have immediate access to the vocabulary for it. "Thank you, Mr. Malone. I'll write up the invoice." Mooney sat at the table. He had the quality of a man who had not slept, but did not feel it yet, running on something cleaner than sleep. He wrote a check while Gumbo itemized 4 days at $500 plus the U-Haul rental and 3 tanks of gas on a fresh legal pad page. And he wrote the check without looking at the total first, which Gumbo noted as the gesture of a man who trusted the accounting or trusted the accountant or both. "One instruction before I go," Gumbo said. Mooney looked up. "Don't sell anything. Not for 6 months, minimum. Don't contact brokers. Don't respond to inquiries. Don't acknowledge the collection exists to anyone you haven't known for 15 years. Change your alarm code, if you haven't already." He paused. "The situation that produced this theft is not resolved. It's in a different phase. Your collection is currently adjacent to something larger than a stolen skull, and the way you survive being adjacent to it is to become invisible until it settles." Mooney was quiet for a moment. Outside, the mockingbird had moved closer. It was running through its catalog with the systematic thoroughness of something that took the work seriously. "How long until it settles?" "I don't know. You'll probably read about it. Not the arts section." Mooney looked at the doorway to the living room, where the crates sat open on the floor and the mastodon skull had been removed from its foam and was presumably back on its shelf in the bottom center of the display. The gap closed, the room restored to the order he had maintained for 19 years. He looked at it, the way you look at something through a doorway when you're thinking about something else. "The bones have been underground for 12,000 years, he said. "I suppose they can wait a little longer." Gumbo drove the U-Haul back to the rental lot on 34th Street and signed the return paperwork and got into the Ranger, which was where he'd left it the night before, and pointed it south towards Cedar Key. His phone showed 11:40. Blue sky, low humidity, a good day for the drive. He had a check in the center console and a completed case in his legal pad, and the particular clean feeling of a job that had gone from problem to solution without anyone getting hurt. He drove south on 75 with the window down and the radio, finding a country station out of Gainesville, and thought about nothing in particular for the first time in 4 days. His phone rang at 1:17. Tampa area code. Number he didn't know. He looked at it for 2 rings. Tampa was not a city he had conducted any business in, or given his number to, in any context he could reconstruct. Tampa area codes belonged to approximately 4 million people, and at least one person who had Tuck Party's number, and Darlene Pickett's number, and probably a list of everyone who had touched those 3 specimens in the last 3 weeks. He answered. "Mr. Malone." The voice was measured, mid-register, carrying the specific quality of someone who had made a great many phone calls and understood exactly how much could be communicated through tone before a word of content was delivered. "My name is Ernesto Vega. I represent certain collector interests in the Florida fossil market. I'd like to speak with you briefly about the items you recently recovered on behalf of a client in Gainesville. Gumbo drove. He kept his speed at 68 and his eyes on the road and thought about what kind of person opened a call that way. Not a threat. The phrasing was too careful for threat. A briefing. Someone who had information he thought Gumbo should have and had decided, for his own reasons, that Gumbo should have it. I'm listening, Gumbo said. Not on the phone. I'd prefer a brief meeting. I understand you're currently southbound on I-75. There's a parking structure off West Shore Boulevard in Tampa that would require approximately 40 minutes out of your route. Third floor, open face, northeast corner. Say 2:30. A man who knew his current location and direction of travel. A man who had prepared a meeting site in advance. A man who said I'd prefer rather than you will, which was a meaningful distinction. 2:30, Gumbo said. He took the West Shore exit and found the garage without difficulty, which meant it had been chosen for findability, as well as whatever else it had been chosen for. He drove to the third floor and parked facing the ramp with the ranger's nose pointed at the exit, because that was the geometry that made sense, and got out and stood near the open edge. Tampa spread out below him in the midday haze, the bay visible to the south between the office towers, white and flat. Traffic on West Shore. A Southwest jet on final into TPA dropping through the haze in the middle distance, gear down, the sound reaching him 3 seconds after the image. He stood and waited, and thought about Tuck Party's freight train metaphor and which train was coming from which direction. Ernesto Vega arrived at 2:28, which told Gumbo he had been in the garage earlier, probably the floor above, watching the entrance ramp. He came from the stairwell door rather than the elevator, which was correct procedure for a man who preferred to know what was behind him. The linen sport coat was the first thing. September in Tampa ran in the low 90s, and the humidity was structural, and Vega was wearing a bone-colored linen sport coat over a dark shirt with the collar open, and he looked completely comfortable in it, in the way that some people look comfortable in things that should be uncomfortable, which said something about either his temperature regulation or his priorities. Gumbo had met a few people like this over 11 years in corporate logistics. They were always either completely in control of their environment or completely indifferent to it, and in Vega's case, it appeared to be both. He was thin, precise in his movements, the kind of thin that was deliberate rather than constitutive. He stopped 10 feet from Gumbo and stood at the open edge and looked at Tampa for a moment before he looked at Gumbo, which was a way of establishing that he was not in a hurry and did not need anything from the view that he didn't already have. Mr. Malone, thank you for coming. You said it wasn't far off my route. A brief, precise smile. I did. He turned slightly toward the bay, his hands clasped behind him, a man giving a briefing to a colleague rather than a warning to an inconvenience. I'll be direct, as I think that serves both of us. The specimens your client recovered through your efforts were originally destined for an overseas buyer through a supply chain I manage. They were taken from your client's possession by a party operating under instruction from a competing interest in this market, a party who believes that your client's sources of acquisition constitute a proprietary pipeline he has a claim on. He's wrong about the claim, but he is persistent about it. Gumbo said nothing. This was more than he'd expected in the first 2 minutes, and he wanted to see how far it went unprompted. Vega let a beat pass and continued. Your recovery of the specimens and their return to your client has introduced what I'll call an additional variable. The competing party is aware of it. He has a particular relationship with the concept of embarrassment. He doesn't absorb it gracefully. What I want you to understand is that your client's continued quiet possession of those specimens is achievable, and I have an interest in that outcome, but it requires those specimens to remain very quiet for a period of time. He paused. A matter of months. Not indefinitely. Very quiet, Gumbo said. No movement. No market activity. No broker contact. The collection should, for practical purposes, not exist. I've already given that instruction to my client. Vega looked at him for the first time with something other than the briefing register, a small recalibration. A man adjusting his assessment of who he was talking to. Good. Then we're aligned. He looked back at the bay. I also want you to understand the shape of what's happening so that you can calibrate your own exposure. The competing party took the theft as a corrective action in a territorial dispute that has been developing for some time. The return of the specimens will read to him as a reversal of that correction. He will want to understand how the reversal happened and who facilitated it. You are, by virtue of your role, a visible part of that answer. He said visible, the way you say it about a nail that is sticking up. Are you telling me to be careful? I'm telling you the weather, Vega said. What you do with a weather report is your own business. He uncoupled his hands from behind his back and straightened his jacket with two small economical gestures. I won't take more of your time. You have a drive ahead of you. He went back to the stairwell door. He did not hurry. The door closed behind him without sound, the kind of door that had been chosen or modified to close that way. Gumbo stood at the open edge of the third floor and watched Tampa go about its Wednesday afternoon below him. A water taxi crossing the bay in the middle distance, white wake spreading and then flattening. The Southwest jet was long gone, and another one was on final now, same descent path, same gear-down geometry, as if the same plane kept making the same approach and he kept watching it from different angles. He thought about what had just happened, which was a man in a September linen jacket telling him, with great precision and considerable courtesy, that someone was angry and Gumbo was in his field of view. He got in the Ranger and drove north on West Shore, and then east toward 75, and he called Darlene Pickett. He got voicemail. He left no message. He called again 40 minutes later, past the interchange, the Ranger back in its lane on 75 heading northeast, the Tampa skyline gone behind him, and the Florida interior opening up ahead, the landscape flattening back into pine and palmetto, and the long straight geometry of a state built for water movement rather than people. She picked up on the fourth ring. Her voice was different from the shop voice. Tighter, the words given slightly more consideration before release, a woman listening to herself as she talked. Gumbo had heard this register before. It was the voice of someone who had received a visit they hadn't wanted and was still processing the vocabulary of it. Darlene. It's Malone. A pause. I figured you'd call. Something happened. This morning. Man came by the shop around 9. She stopped. He could hear her decide how much to say and land on enough. Dwayne Birch. Asking about a PI from Cedar Key. Whether I'd talked to one, what I might have said. What did you tell him? I told him a man came in looking for tourist fossils, and I sold him a bag of shark teeth. A beat. He didn't believe me. But he didn't push it, which means either he already knew or he's not sure enough to push. Her voice had a controlled quality, the voice of someone performing calm, because calm was the useful thing to perform. You need to know that man does not respond well to people working in what he considers his territory. He's been North Central Florida for 20 years, and he has a long memory and a specific relationship with embarrassment. Specific relationship with embarrassment. The same phrase, essentially, that Vega had used. Two people who knew Dwayne Birch from different angles, arriving at the same vocabulary. Are you all right? Gumbo asked. A short silence. I've been doing business in this market for 22 years, Mr. Malone. Dwayne Birch is not the first difficult person to come through that door. She said it with the flat steadiness of a woman who had decided exactly how much of her reaction she was going to show and had stuck to it. But I'd appreciate it if your name didn't come through that door again. Understood, Gumbo said. Thank you for the peanuts. She hung up without answering that, which was its own kind of answer. He drove. The check engine light came on at the Ocala interchange, and he tapped the dashboard above the glove box and it went off. The ranger had opinions about Ocala, and he had stopped trying to understand them. He was 20 minutes north of Ocala on 301, the two-lane running straight through a landscape of horse farms and scrubland, and the occasional convenience store set back from the road with a hand-painted sign advertising live bait, when the truck came up behind him. Black F-250 lifted, the suspension adding 6 inches of visual statement above the road. It came up fast in his mirror, and then settled into a matching speed 10 feet off his rear bumper, close enough that he could see the driver clearly in the rear view. Big, heavy-shouldered, pale, a ball cap with a logo he didn't recognize. The truck had 2 flag stickers in the rear window that faced different directions politically and agreed on nothing except the general principle of assertion. It stayed there for a quarter mile. Then the window came down, and an arm came out, and the hand on the end of it made the gesture that meant pull over. Gumbo ran the math. He was on a 2-lane in Alachua County with no cross street visible in either direction. The nearest town several miles back, a truck with 200 more horsepower than the Ranger sitting on his bumper. The man driving it had found his location on a 2-lane state road in the middle of the Florida interior, which meant either he'd been following since Gainesville or he'd had a phone call from someone who knew the route. Either way, this was not an encounter that benefited from acceleration. He pulled onto the gravel shoulder and stopped and put the Ranger in park. The F-250 pulled in behind him, close, and the engine ran for a moment and then went quiet. The driver's door opened, and Dwayne Birch got out, and that resolved the last open question about who this was. He was large, in the way that some men are large without it being merely about size, large in the way of a man who had spent 20 years in an environment where size was a professional asset and had organized his whole self around it, the walk, the posture, the particular set of the shoulders that said, "This is my road, and your presence on it is a courtesy I'm currently extending." He was mid-50s, the face weathered and broad, the kind of face that had started out handsome and been rewritten by decades of outdoor Florida life and the specific stresses of the business he was in. He walked to Gumbo's window without hurrying. Gumbo had the window down when he got there. Birch put one hand on the roof of the Ranger and looked in at him with the expression of a man conducting an assessment he had already mostly completed. His eyes moved once to the back seat, no cargo, just the legal pad in the folder, and returned to Gumbo's face. "Malone. Mr. Birch." A brief pause. Something behind Birch's eyes registered the use of his name and recalibrated slightly. He'd come here knowing who Gumbo was, and Gumbo knowing who he was a variable he was now incorporating. "You've been busy," he said. "Finished a job. Heading home." "Job's the thing I want to talk about." He shifted his weight and looked down the empty road in both directions, a man confirming privacy rather than seeking escape. "You were hired to recover 3 specimens from a collector in Gainesville. The specimens were taken on my behalf from that collector because that collector was buying from a source that runs product through my territory without my arrangement. The taking was a message. The fact that a PI from Cedar Key returned them is a message back, and it's not a message I commissioned." He said it with the flat precision of a man making a business statement rather than a personal one. Not anger, exactly. The register of someone who was describing an accounting discrepancy that required correction. "I was hired to find stolen property and return it," Gumbo said. "That's the job." "I understand that. I'm not here about the job." He looked at Gumbo steadily. "I'm here because the man who hired me to take those specimens did not inform me that he'd done it, and I found out through a PI coming through my territory, which is backwards from how things should run. That's an internal problem, and it stays internal. He paused. But you're visible, Malone. You moved through 4 or 5 parts of my operations geography in the last 4 days, and you talk to people I have relationships with. That makes you a loose thread, and I don't like loose threads. Gumbo kept his hands on the wheel where they were visible, and his voice in the register of a man having a professional conversation on the side of a road. I have a client in Gainesville with his property back. The case is closed. I have no interest in your operation, your territory, your supply chain, or anything about the market I walk through to do my job. I do not intend to walk through it again. Birch looked at him for a long moment. The assessment was complete, and he was now deciding what to do with its conclusion. Gumbo had the sense of a man who had expected either more resistance or more fear, and was recalibrating in real time for the space between them. The man running the other end of this, Birch said. Vega. You've talked to him. Not a question. I have. What did he tell you? Nothing that concerns your operation. He gave me the same weather report you're giving me. Something moved across Birch's face that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. The expression of a man who had been told something he believed and found it mildly amusing that it was true. Weather report, he said. He looked down the road again. That's one way to put it. He straightened up from the window and took his hand off the ranger's roof. He looked at Gumbo with the flat directness of a man who had said what he came to say and was now completing the transaction. You tell your client to keep his head down. The collection doesn't move, it doesn't get talked about, it doesn't exist for the next little while. You've already told him that, I expect. I have. Good. He looked at Gumbo for one more beat. You keep yours down too. He walked back to the F-250 and got in and started it and pulled out onto 301, the tires throwing a spray of fine gravel against the ranger's door as he went. He accelerated north on the 2-lane, the truck going from a problem to a vehicle to a black speck in the mirror to nothing, the road empty in both directions, the silence returning. Gumbo sat on the gravel shoulder with the ranger ticking beside him and looked at the empty road for a while. He had been directly addressed by both freight trains in the span of 4 hours. Neither had hit him. Vega had been a weather report delivered in a parking garage in a linen jacket. Birch had been a weather report delivered on the shoulder of 301 with gravel on his door. Both men had said the same thing, which was, your part in this is over, stay out, don't be visible. He was, by every reasonable definition, out. He sat and thought about what Tuck Party had said. They're going to make noise at each other before long. And he thought about Vega's phrase, a matter of months, and he thought about Birch's phrase, the next little while, and he noted that both men had used a version of the same time horizon without consulting each other on the phrasing. Two men on opposite ends of the same argument, both describing the same window of pending resolution. They knew something was coming. They both knew it. The only variable was sequence. He thought about what Vega had said about Birch's relationship with embarrassment, and what Darlene had said about it, and what the F-250 on the gravel shoulder had communicated about it nonverbally. A man who had been running north-central Florida for 20 years and considered the roads an extension of his property rights, had had a corrective action reversed by a private investigator from Cedar Key. That was not an abstraction to a man like Birch. That was a specific and textured embarrassment with a face and a name, and a vehicle with a Florida plate that he had just looked at from 10 inches away. Gumbo wrote in the legal pad. He wrote Vega, Tampa, overseas, and Birch, Ocala/N.FL, domestic, and drew a line between them with a question mark above it, the question being not whether something was coming, but what form it would take and who would be standing in the wrong place when it did. Below the question mark he wrote, not my problem. He looked at that for a moment. He started the Ranger and pulled back onto 301 and drove south. The problem with Not My Problem, he had found over 11 months of this career, was that it required the problem to have clear edges. It required the thing you were stepping away from to stay in the place you were stepping away from. The fossil market was not a place with clear edges. It was a network of personal relationships and informal obligations running through half the rivers in Florida, and he had spent 4 days walking through the middle of it and talking to its people and leaving his name in its rooms. Vega had said, "You are a visible part of that answer." He drove south on 301 and then picked up 19 below Micanopy, and the road opened up into the long flat run through Levy County, the scrub giving way to flatwoods and the flatwoods giving way to the coastal marsh as the Gulf came back into the geography. He could smell it before he could see it, the salt and sulfur and low-tide mineral smell of a coast that had been doing what it was doing since before the mastodons came to drink at its edges. His phone stayed quiet. Both freight trains were elsewhere, pointed at each other, the space between them closing by whatever increment it closed by when men like that ran out of intermediate steps. He crossed the bridge onto the island at 4:15, the Gulf going copper in the late light, the pelicans working the channel in their unhurried patrol. He parked at the marina lot and sat in the Ranger for a moment with the engine off and the windows down and the salt air coming through. One thing at a time, he thought. Get on the boat. Deposit the check. Write up the case file. Figure out whether Not My Problem was a conclusion or a starting point. Chapter 5. The Pelican was on the fuel dock piling. Gumbo came down the marina walkway at 4:45 with the folder under his arm and the check in his shirt pocket, and the particular fatigue of a man who had slept in a cargo van and spent the following day talking to people who carried weather systems around with them. The afternoon light was coming low and copper across the channel, the Gulf doing what it did at this hour, the water going colors it declined to repeat at any other time of day. He gave the Pelican a nod and felt no self-consciousness about it this time. He went aboard, set the folder on the wheelhouse table, and stood at the stern for a moment with his hands on the rail. The new cleat was solid under his left hand. He pressed it once, confirmed it, and went below to make coffee. This was the part of the job he had not anticipated when Pete LaFontaine had pointed him at it 14 months ago from a bar stool at the Tiki Torch. Not the finding, not the driving, not the rooms full of people talking around what they meant. Those he'd adjusted to. The part he hadn't anticipated was this, the moment when the case was technically closed and the world it had opened was still very much running, and you were back on your boat in slip 14 with a check and a legal pad and the question of what those two things added up to. He poured his coffee and went back to the stern and sat with it and let the marina do its end-of-day routine around him without requiring anything from him. The job was done. Mooney had his bones. Gumbo had his check. Tuck Party had an empty shop and a lighter conscience and presumably a better week ahead than the one behind him. By every operational definition, this was a completed case, the kind of clean resolution that he could write up in 2 legal pad pages and file and not think about again. The problem was the architecture still standing after the resolution. Vega and Birch in the same market, competing for the same supply chain, each of them running the same clock on the same timeline without having consulted each other on it. Something is coming. The theft was the opening move of a repositioning that hadn't finished repositioning, and returning the specimens hadn't stopped the repositioning. It had just removed Mooney from the trajectory of it, which was the job, which was enough. He thought about enough for a while. In logistics, enough was a precise word. It meant the shipment arrived. It meant the manifest was satisfied. It did not mean the road was safe, or the carrier was honest, or that the next shipment wouldn't have the same problem. Enough was a professional term with a hard boundary, and the boundary was the edge of the mandate. His mandate was satisfied. The specimens were home. The client had been instructed. The case was closed. He finished his coffee and went inside and called Mooney. Mooney picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Malone." His voice had the settled quality of a man who had spent the afternoon in his living room with his collection restored, and had found the experience restorative in the specific way that only the thing you'd been missing can restore you. "I want to make sure you have the full picture before I close this out," Gumbo said. He laid it out plainly. The two-track market, the territorial dispute that had been building since spring, the theft as a corrective action in that dispute rather than a simple acquisition, the return of the specimens as an unintended variable in a situation already under pressure. He told Mooney about the parking garage in Tampa and the gravel shoulder on 301 without identifying either man by name, because names were details Mooney didn't need, and having them would only generate anxiety in exchange for no useful information. He told him 6 months minimum. Nothing moves. The collection doesn't exist. If anyone contacts him about any piece in the house, broker, buyer, interested party, old friend from the network, the answer is the same. He's not collecting anymore. Health reasons, the collection is in storage. He'll pass along the contact information when things settle. A plausible story that closes the door without burning the relationship. Mooney was quiet for a moment. Gumbo had learned over 4 days that Mooney's silences were working silences, a man processing information rather than avoiding it. "How will I know when it's over?" "You'll read about it." The resolution of this kind of dispute tends to produce documentation. Law enforcement gets interested, or one party absorbs the other in a way that makes the news, or it goes quiet in a way that has its own informational quality. You'll recognize it when you see it. And if it goes quiet the wrong way. A fair question from a man who had been in this market for 19 years and understood its weather. "Then you'll read about that too, and I'll call you when I do." Another silence. Then Mooney said, with the genuine curiosity of a collector who had spent 2 decades in a world most people didn't know existed and was still interested in how it worked, "Do you think they'll actually go at each other?" Gumbo thought about the parking garage and the linen jacket and the phrase, "a matter of months." He thought about the gravel shoulder on 301 and the F-250 accelerating north and the phrase, "the next little while." 2 men describing the same window from opposite ends of it. I think 2 organizations that have been operating in adjacent lanes for years and are now fighting over the same inventory are working through the stages of a problem that only resolves one way, he said. I don't know which way that is yet, but it resolves. Mooney was quiet for a moment. Through the phone, Gumbo could hear the house, the faint hum of the climate control systems, the particular silence of a room that held 312 objects from the deep past and maintained the conditions they required. "The bones have been underground for 12,000 years, Mooney said. I suppose they can wait a little longer." "That's the right posture," Gumbo said. He hung up and sat for a moment with the phone on the table, and the marina going quiet outside and the channel light changing on the water. Then he got out the legal pad and wrote up the case. 2 pages. He'd learned to keep them to 2 pages, enough to reconstruct the logic of what happened if he ever needed to, not so much that the writing became its own project. He wrote the names in a column, Mooney, Pickett, Party. He wrote Vega and Birch in a separate column to the right, with a line between the columns and a question mark above the line, because the question of what happened between those 2 men was still open, and the question mark was the honest notation. He drew arrows between names where the connections ran. Mooney to Pickett across 11 years of broker relationship, Pickett to Party across the contract, Party to both columns via the specimens that had made him temporarily the most inconveniently located man in north-central Florida. He wrote specimens returned, intact in the center of the page, and put a box around it. That was the mandate. That was the closed part. He pinned the 2 pages to the corkboard above the chart table, where the previous case's documentation still lived in its own column of post-its and arrows. 2 cases on the board. Neither fully resolved in the larger sense. The Everglades case had its own open architecture, its own weather still organizing itself offshore. Both complete in the professional sense. He looked at the board and thought about whether professional completion and actual resolution were the same thing, and concluded, as he had before, that they were not, and that the distinction was real but not his to collapse. He was a pie in slip 14. He found things and returned them. The world those things moved through was above his pay grade and outside his jurisdiction, and would continue to operate entirely without his input. He peeled the post-it from the steering wheel, $500 per day plus expenses, 4 days, and stuck it to the bottom of the right column on the corkboard. He looked at the number. Then he took out his phone and deposited the check through the banking app, standing at the chart table with the corkboard in front of him, and watched the balance update. Enough, he thought. In the precise sense. He pulled Torrealba's card from his wallet and looked at it for a moment. Collier County Sheriff's, the direct line in her handwriting across the bottom, the ink a little faded now from 11 months in the card slot. He'd used the number once. He told himself on the drive down 301 that it was time to use it again, and the drive had confirmed it, and here he was on the other side of the drive still holding the card. He dialed. 3 rings. Then Torrealba. The voice was exactly as he remembered it. Flat, direct, a woman who answered the phone the way she probably did everything, which was without preamble, and without performing anything she didn't mean. He'd spent 48 hours in her vicinity during the Everglades case, and had formed a precise opinion of her, which was that she read situations correctly and quickly, and then acted on the reading, and that both parts of that were rarer than they should be. It's Malone. Cedar Key. A beat. I know who it is. Not unfriendly. Factual. What did you walk into? He told her the shape of it. Not the client, not the specifics of the collection. Not anything that would create a professional obligation for her where none currently existed. The market and its structure, the 2-track system, the domestic end running north-central Florida, the overseas end running out of Tampa, the territorial friction that had been building since spring, the theft as proxy for a larger argument about supply chain ownership. The names, because names were the useful part, Dwayne Birch, Ernesto Vega. The timeline both of them had implied without coordinating. She listened without interrupting. He'd noticed this about her during the Everglades case too. She listened the way good investigators listened, which was all the way through without filling the space with the sounds of listening. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, Birch and Vega in the same sandbox. That's been building since March. She said it the way you say something you've been watching develop and have been waiting for someone else to catch up to. Not I told you so. She hadn't told him anything, this was the first conversation, but the tone of a person confirming a weather system they'd already clocked on radar. We've had eyes on the fossil end of Vega's operation for 8 months. The Birch angle is newer, but it was coming. I stayed out of it, Gumbo said. The job was the specimens. The specimens are back. I know. You did it clean. A pause. The collector keeps his head down. Instructed. He's a careful man. Good. Another pause, shorter. You stay out of the sandbox, Malone. Already out. Stay out. He could hear her recalibrating to something less operational. How's Cedar Key? Pelican's back. A brief silence that had something in it that might have been amusement if Torrealba did amusement, which he wasn't entirely sure she did. Different pelican. Probably, he said. Same piling. She hung up without ceremony, which was the correct way to end that kind of call, and the way he'd expected her to end it. He set the phone down on the chart table and stood for a moment in the wheelhouse with the corkboard in front of him, and the evening coming through the windows, and the marina settling into the last of the light. Somewhere in Tampa, Vega was looking at his market share and the calendar and doing arithmetic. Somewhere north of Ocala, Birch was doing the same arithmetic and arriving at a different conclusion about what the answer required. The bones were underground again, in a climate-controlled room in Gainesville, lit from inside their cases with clean white light, and they had been waiting 12,000 years already, and they were very good at it. Gumbo went out to the stern and sat with the last of the evening, and the channel going dark below the pier lights, and the gulf out beyond the channel doing what it did, which was everything, indifferently without reference to what was happening on its edges. The cleat was solid under his hand. He sat with that for a while. It was 3 weeks later when Pete LaFontaine called from the tiki torch. 8:15 on a Thursday evening, the kind of call that had a specific ambient quality, bar sounds, ice in glasses, the particular background register of the tiki torch at the point in the evening when the after-work crowd had thinned and the serious regulars had settled in. Gumbo. You busy? No. He was sitting at the chart table with the corkboard in front of him, and a cold beer going warm beside the legal pad, which was open to a blank page. He'd been looking at the blank page for 20 minutes. I've got someone here with a problem. Came in an hour ago. Asked the bartender if he knew anyone who did the kind of work that wasn't the kind of work you called the police about, and the bartender sent him to me. A pause with the background of the bar in it. Pete, is it the kind of thing I should hear? That's a good question, and I'll give you a straight answer. It's unusual. How unusual? Pete was quiet for a moment. In the background, glass on wood, someone laughing at something that happened at the far end of the bar. Remember that orthodontist I sent you? Clearly. It's nothing like that. A pause. It's weirder. Gumbo looked at the corkboard. The two cases in their columns, the arrows and the names and the question mark still sitting above the line between Vega and Birch, unanswered and patient. He looked at the blank page on the legal pad. He looked at his phone's banking app icon, which he did not open, because he already knew the number and knew what it said about the month ahead. He looked at the cleat through the open stern door, solid on the deck and the dock lights, doing the job it was supposed to do. I'll be there in an hour, he said. He closed the legal pad to the blank page and put it under his arm. Some things you just want to know are solid before you walk into whatever's next. The rest you figure out on the drive. The end. Discover more of the weird, wacky side of Florida with this gift. Orange You Glad, a Gumbo Weird Mystery.